Hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's program. And today I want to look at a pretty cool study review paper, which looked at a lot of different infectious diseases that can be contracted via rituals, whether they be religious rituals or non religious rituals. Now, I've seen papers like this, similar papers like this before, but this one is very comprehensive and covers quite a few different areas. So I just wanted to share it. And I want to, with some of the diseases, I want to go ahead and turn to articles from the website, um, which talk a little bit about those particular diseases. So, because not everybody's going to be familiar with everything on here. So, I want to at least shed a little bit of light on some of them. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the paper. And it's from the Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Infectious Diseases. And it's entitled A Review of Infectious Diseases Associated with Religious and Non-Religious Rituals. And let's just go ahead and start, right? The paper talks about, how rituals are part of the fabric of human society, whether they be religious or non-religious. Um, and however, several of these, well, everything that we're going to be talking about, but there's probably others too, um, have been implicated in infectious diseases and the people that partake in it. So let's take a look at some of them. Now, here's one about self-flagellation and HTLV and hepatitis C. Okay, not a big surprise, really. Self-flagellation is a religious practice carried out by Shia Muslims commemorating the martyrdom of Hussein ibn Ali. I probably didn't pronounce that correctly, but I tried. It was also practiced in middle-aged Christian life, and nowadays it is still used by some groups such as Opus Dei communities. And basically, they're whipping their bodies with sharp instruments that cause bleeding. And a lot of times they're sharing the instruments for the self flagellation, which is transmitting uh, viral disease, bloodborne viral disease from one person to the other. And they talk about a recent a study where um, asymptomatic HTLV1 infection thought to be acquired via self-flagellation among 10 heterosexual Muslim men, mostly of Indian and Pakistani origin, living in the UK. And the infections were discovered during the screening during blood donations. And 8 of the 10 men had a history of sharing equipment for self-flagellation. In another study, they talk about from Australia, 25 HTLV1 positive prospective blood donors during a 7-year period between 2012 and 2018 were reported to have engaged in self-flagellation. And again, they were from India and Pakistan. So HTLV1, something that is screened for in blood donations here in the United States. Also, when you're talking about bloodborne pathogens, the article does say self-flagellation has been found to be a risk factor for hepatitis C infection. And it has been reported to account for 5% of hepatitis C infections among Iranian blood donors. Now, these of course are viral infections, but there was when I think of self-flagellation, because I've actually witnessed this before, I think of a bacterial infection, and I think of the Philippines. And let me go ahead and take a look at that real quick. An article from some years ago, but it's something that's basically I could have repeated every year because it goes on every Holy Week season in the Philippines, the Good Friday to Easter holiday season. And in the Philippines, every time around that time of year, they discuss people getting tetanus shots prior to the Holy Week celebration. Philippines is a predominantly Catholic country. And in certain areas, particularly the Pampanga province, which is where Clark Air Base used to be located at when it existed, you would see people walking down the street, whipping themselves. I doubt all the instruments were clean, and other people would be crucified on actual crosses with spikes through the hands. So there was always this big risk of tetanus. And each year, the Philippines Department of Health warned of the risk of tetanus from the instruments used in the ritual, contaminated blades, whips, and nails, and advised if you're going to partake in these rituals, ensure that your tetanus shots are up to date. So this goes on every year. The DOH in that country sends out the same warning every time around March to April, depending on when Easter is. Anyway, so I just wanted to share that with you. That's something that wasn't in the review, and I thought it probably should have been. It's a very interesting case, and it's clearly there's a lot of danger to that. Let me go ahead and go back to the paper real quick, and here we are. And let's go ahead and continue. ORF virus. This is a pox virus, and it's been reported during, and again, forgive my pronunciation, Eid al-adha. I take it that's a Muslim celebration. And during that celebration, there's lamb sacrifices, apparently. And the consumption, and then there's, during the lamb sacrifice, there's accidental hand lacerations while handling the animal. So ORF virus, which is primarily a virus of sheep and those kind of animals, can become an infection for human beings when they perform procedures like this. So that's something to consider. Moving on, blood brotherhood. Never heard of this. And they say blood brotherhood rituals involve superficial cutting of fingers, hands, or forearms, and pressing the bleeding areas together with another person as a sign of bonding and loyalty. And apparently this has been a ritual practiced for centuries all over the world. And of course, this is an obvious, this carries an obvious risk for the transmission of bloodborne pathogens. And in 2007, they report out on a study in Turkey that revealed that almost 1/4 of the 2,300 high school students, both male and female, participated in blood brotherhood rituals, and nearly 1/3 of 1,615 continue to participate. About 29% of the blood brotherhood participants had a history of hepatitis B infection. In one study, 7 of 52 blood donors who were found to have antibody to hepatitis C admitted having blood brothers or sisters while in school. So yeah, and clearly there's got to be some kind of HIV transmission risk that goes along with this too. So just another risky thing. I didn't know this existed, but there you go. Blood brotherhood and the transmission of bloodborne diseases. Then it talks about some situations with scarification and female genital mutilation. The cultural practice of bloodletting was common in the 1980s in parts of rural Africa. This, along with group circumcision and scarification in certain African cultures, performed with the use of shared instruments. Aha, there's your problem there. These may have contributed to the spread of HIV. Similar cultural practices, including blood suction in folk medicine in other parts of the world, have been responsible for the spread of hepatitis B and C viruses. Here we go. An earlier study found a statistically higher prevalence of hepatitis B surface antigen among South African Bantu community who underwent ritual scarification by witch doctors, suggesting transmission of hepatitis B via unsterilized instruments. And of course, HIV is another issue. Ritualistic female genital mutilation, including gashiri cutting, which they say is a form of female genital mutilation practiced in parts of Africa, performed for a variety of purposes, such as the transition of girls to womanhood, have been associated not only with viral infections like HIV and herpes, hepatitis B, but also Clostridium tetani, chlamydia, Neisseria gonorrhea, syphilis, and the parasite Trichomonas vaginalis. Widow inheritance and HIV in similar rituals. Again, something I've never heard of. In some African cultures, widows and widowers are considered impure and undergo ritual purification to prevent ill fortune. While the widowers are cleansed with water and herbs, the widows undergo pita-kufa or kuchinga, which involve unprotected sexual intercourse with the purifiers, often the deceased relatives, who then inherit the widows. So you have, this risky sexual activity going on, where HIV is being transmitted, and other types of, I suppose, other types of viral infections too that can be transmitted via unprotected sexual intercourse, and bacterial infections too. But the paper specifically talks about HIV. In certain African communities, ceremonial rites of adolescent girls around the time of puberty include rituals like, again, show mercy on my pronunciation, kusa sa fombi, cleansing the dust, kuchatska, removing dust, and kutaya mufuta, spilling the oil, where girls are encouraged to have sexual activity with boys. Similarly, disco and funerals, which involve music and dance, often to raise money for funeral services, are often venues for meeting places of young girls and boys, and the music and dance, intermingled with alcohol and drugs, often result in unprotected and sometimes forced sexual activities in communities with high HIV prevalence. So, yeah, these are things that are going on, and a lot of us are thoroughly unaware. I can say that I am one of them that are thoroughly unaware. Rift Valley fever, this is something that we cover pretty frequently on the website. And we see outbreaks in Africa, primarily in people that are dealing with livestock. Now, there's a ritual sacrifice of a ram during Eid al-adha festival. And when they sacrifice the ram, if it's infected with Rift Valley fever, the aerosolization, the contact with the body fluids can spread the Rift Valley fever virus to the people, the person handling the animal. So that's always a risk. Importation and smuggling of animals from Somalia for sacrifice during this festival have led to outbreaks of Rift Valley fever in non-endemic countries. So Ebola, not a big surprise. We know about the big risk when it comes to funerals and dealing with the dead. And that's something, health authorities have worked very hard on, is to prevent family members and others from touching the dead body. But there are some rituals that go along with some of these countries where they see Ebola. Ritual washing, cleaning, and clothing the deceased body in preparation for burial. Hand washing in a common bowl and then touching the deceased body as a sign of love touch by the relatives are common practices in certain African communities, which clearly enhances the spread of the Ebola virus. One thing is in a deceased person, the viral load is typically higher than with somebody that's alive. So there's a lot of risk there. And then it talks about laying over the deceased body of prominent traditional healers is another means of Ebola spread. There are reports of traditional healers cutting the skin of the Ebola victims and rubbing herbal medicine in the cut wound and subsequently getting infected themselves and spreading the infection to others through this practice. So, yeah, very dangerous stuff. And I actually did a podcast with Dr. Glenn Laverick about safe burials. For somebody who died from Ebola. And I even have a podcast, and it's worth checking out. I go ahead and I'll link to that so you can check it out. Yeah, a lot of effort has been put into, um, preventing the spread of Ebola by these means, by these burial rituals that they've really have to educate the population about the risk. Neonatal Hsv infection. Well, I've covered this a number of times on the website, particularly up in New York City, where Jewish male infants that are getting circumcised. This is called a bris. The procedure involves a metzitza, where the circumcision, the moil, this is the person that does the circumcision, orally sucks the blood from the baby's penis. This process can lead to HSV transmission from the moil, who could have herpes simplex in the mouth, to the infant. And it can be incredibly dangerous. A neonatal, a young baby can get systemic herpes, which can be life-threatening. So it's very, very serious. And I've done a number of stories on that up in New York City. We see several cases every year, and there was a time there was quite a few more, but education is trying to get out there to prevent that type of infection. Then it talks about religious gatherings and COVID, and the example they use here is last year in Daegu, South Korea, where there was a church, a religious sect that was the setting of a super spreader event, I guess you could put it that way. And people had COVID, and the virus was spreading via singing and other worshiping activities. So that they threw that in here. Now, rituals and bacterial infection. The ritual sprinkling of holy water, and there's a whole bunch of different cases they talk about here where somebody might be having a surgery, in this case, a tibial fracture requiring a rectus abdominis muscle flap with split skin graft. They took the graft and they sprinkled it with holy water, and which had Klebsiella in it, and the bacteria Klebsiella, and the individual ended up getting a Klebsiella infection at the surgical site. They talk about another one of a young boy who got Acinetobacter, very highly drug-resistant bacterium, again, from holy water that they used, during his procedure. And Pseudomonas aeruginosa, the same thing, sprinkling holy water on the patient, and the culture of the water from the bottle grew Pseudomonas aeruginosa. This goes on and on. It's a lot of the what we call water bugs have been implicated in these different rituals. Mycobacterium Bovis. In this case, it has been linked to another Muslim festival, Eid al-Kabir, and this honors the willingness of Abraham to sacrifice his son Ishmael. And in this case, the let's see, make sure I got the right. This woman washed the viscera, including the lungs, of a veterinary uncontrolled slaughtered sheep for 2 hours in an enclosed space at home before cooking and consuming it with her family. 22 days later, upon return to France, she started getting all these symptoms: fever, cough, anorexia. And she had a lung infection, and it was Mycobacterium Bovis that she got from the animal. Brucellosis, again, the religious rituals of ceremonial slaughtering of sheep in Ethiopian-born Jews in Israel. So they've seen outbreaks of that. Cutaneous anthrax, another bacterial infection. In some folk cultures, there's a tradition of smearing slaughtered animals' blood on the forehead. In one report, 2 brothers aged 5 and 6 presented with forehead and periorbital swelling with necrotic center. A week prior to this presentation, their father had smeared the blood of a slaughtered cow on their forehead. The wound cultures of both brothers were confirmed to be Bacillus anthracis. So, yeah, so it's pretty serious stuff. Excuse me. In India, there's a big religious gathering called Kumbh Mela, and they gather on the banks of the holy rivers in India, where millions of Hindu devotees gather every 12 years. In 2013, an estimated 120 people attended the festival. Ritualistic bathing and dipping in the holy rivers are common practice. And a lot of cholera epidemics result because of this, because of fecal contamination of the river water, overcrowding, and lack of sanitation. So this ritual has been going on for a couple centuries now. Sometimes they drink the river water, the holy water. So there's a lot of risks. So there's been a number of cholera epidemics in the past. It's been a while, but they do typically see some cases. So that's just another issue. Sporotrichosis, that's a fungal infection. We call that rose gardener's disease. Typically, if you're in your garden, you get stuck with one of the thorns from a rose, it could have the spores of this fungus. But in this, they say extensive body tattooing has been observed in Samoa for centuries. In Samoan tattooing, the teeth of the tattoo comb are made of boar's bone, and the pigment is made up of soot and ink, latter obtained by crushing the seeds of candle nut tree. One case report described a 36-year-old Samoan immigrant in Australia who developed culture-proven cutaneous sporotrichosis following traditional body tattooing. So, yeah. Angiostrungulus Rat Lungworm. This is something that we've talked about on the website a number of times. We do see cases, sometimes outbreaks in Hawaii, basically on an annual basis. Sometimes we see cases in Florida periodically, people coming from the islands. This is a parasite, a roundworm, and you usually get it after eating vegetables that are contaminated with slugs, snails, that kind of stuff. But in a ritual scenario, they write a divine reason for ingesting raw mollusk has also been invoked. Followers of Afro-Brazilian religions, Candomblé and Umbanda, may be required to ingest raw mollusk while performing their religious rituals and sacrificial offerings. Well, this is a very serious parasite, and it's one that can get in the spinal fluid, into the brain, and it can be very, very serious. So again, something to keep in mind. Cutaneous larva migraines. This is linked to hookworm that infect dogs. Now they'll infect humans, but they won't totally mature there. So they'll cause a cutaneous type of infection, then they'll eventually die. Well, cutaneous larval migraines associated with side rolls known as Angiostrungulus, right? This is Sanskrit for rolling around in a temple, I guess, and has been reviewed previously. In this ritual, devotees lay on the ground and roll sideways in the temple premises. This maneuver brings the bare part of the body in contact with temple floor, infested with hookworm larvae from stray dogs. Boy. Naegleria meningoencephalitis, Naegleria fowleri, something that we talk about on the website, on this podcast a lot. It's one of the parasites I'm more interested in. And of course, talked about this before, where in certain Islamic traditions, they do ritual ablution. It's a nasal irrigation, and people can pick up the parasite if the water is contaminated. And this is likely why Pakistan sees such high numbers of Naegleria fowleri infections. It's likely due to the ritual ablution procedures. Okay, rituals in prions, right? Prions are a abnormal protein that kind of goes rogue, and it's 100% fatal. It's very, very serious stuff. So this is something that we don't see anymore because it's basically been eliminated, thanks to a lot of education. The last Kuru related death was reported in 2005. This is something that was seen in Papua New Guinea for, most of the last century and into part of this century. And let me go ahead and bring up a story that I wrote in 2009 about Kuru, and we'll take a look at that because very interesting stuff. It's pretty scary stuff too. It's hard to imagine, that this stuff is done at any time. Okay, so here's this article. I actually wrote this in 2009 when I was writing for a website called examiner.com, but I transferred it to my website. And let's take a look at this real quick. So you get a little feeling. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea in the 1950s and 60s, it was noticed that people, mostly women of the Fore tribe, F-O-R-E tribe, were dying of what was originally thought to be a genetic disorder since it happened among family members. The disease stole away the affected person's ability to talk, walk, and eat, and they eventually died into a shivering death. Anyway, they discovered, by looking at brain tissue way back then, that it was a prion disease. At first, they called it a slow virus, but it soon to become known as a prion disease, this transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. Over 1,100 people died of Kuru for 10 years from 1957 to 1968. The 4 people were involved in ritualistic cannibalism. Upon the death of a person in the tribe, the women would prepare and consume the corpse, remove the arms and the feet, stripping the muscle from the limbs, and remove and eat the brain. The women were also known to feed portions of the human brains to their children. The brain tissue from the corpse with Kuru is highly infectious and a certain death sentence. So, yeah. Kuru had a long incubation period, ranging from 2 years to 2 decades. And it goes over the different types of symptoms. The first stage, unsteadiness of stance, voice, gait, eyes, tremor, slurring. Second stage was not being able to walk, tremors, muscle jerks, outburst of laughter, and mental slowing. And the last stage, the terminal stage, the person is unable to sit up, tremors, urinary and fecal incontinence, difficulty swallowing, and death. So yeah, pretty serious stuff. Let me go ahead and get the study back up real quick. It's not always the easiest thing to do, is switching around these things I want to share. But yeah, so here it says Kuru, now an extinct disease, which was endemic in Papua New Guinea. Let's see. The disease was related to ritualistic transsumption, which is just that eating of the person's body. With the prohibition of ritualistic transsumption in the 1950s, the number of deaths from Kuru declined sharply, with the last death reported in 2005. So let's hope that doesn't come back. That's pretty devastating stuff. Anyway, so yeah, that's what we got. That's interesting study. Well, not even study. It's a paper, and it just kind of goes over this these different rituals and the things that people were contracting from these rituals. Very interesting stuff, and I hope you enjoyed this. Good stuff. I will see you next time on Outbreak News TV. And don't forget, like the video, share it with your friends, comment below, subscribe to the channel. All these things will help out the success for Outbreak News TV. Again, thanks a lot.